All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this episode of Lean in Olympia. My name is Corey Passons. I'm here with Interfaith Works. Interfaith Works is a social justice nonprofit serving the Thurston County area. We are the area's largest social service provider for homeless adults. We're also a coalition of 30 plus diverse faith communities and affiliated organizations, and we host a bi-weekly podcast called Lean in Olympia. So welcome to this. If you want to check out past episodes, we have Spotify and YouTube, and you can also check out our website at interfaith-works.org if you want to check out past episodes. So our guest today is Lily Raabe. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Corey.
Good to see you today. Good to meet you. We've met on the phone, but just in person, just right now. So this is wonderful to have you here. I really appreciate you making time to be with us. You are the new artistic director at the Olympia Family Theater. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have just a brief bio here, and then you can add to that, and we'll get into the work. You hold a Master's of Arts in Educational Theater for colleges and communities from New York University, with a focus on applied theater, directing the theater of the oppressed, and new works development. When was that degree?
2012?
Oh, great. Okay.
I think, yes.
And then a BA in drama from University of Portland. You have 20 years experience as a teaching artist, having worked with public schools and nonprofits, including the New Group, acting Opening Act New York, Oregon's Children's Theater, Northwest Children's Theater, and many more. And you've devised over 10 original productions with communities of all ages, including musicals, and directed over 15 new works. You've been busy.
Yeah.
Is it fun to hear the bio back?
Totally, yeah.
Oh, that's great. And then you're passionate about racial and social justice and have done work with incarcerated communities here in Washington too. And we'll spend some time getting to that. I'd love to hear more about that work. So thanks for coming here today. And we will get to the work, but wanted to just begin by getting to know you and your story. Where are you from?
Well, that's always a loaded question. So I grew up on a school bus, which is a fun thing, and lived on a school bus with my parents until I was 15. And then we built a house. We built an A-frame because my dad doesn't like square houses, which is very on brand. So we built a non-square house. And we homesteaded in rural Eastern Oregon. I think my parents, coming from Southern California, had always had this thing in their mind of living in the mountains and someplace where there's tumbleweeds and sagebrush and that kind of thing. So we homesteaded in Baker City, really 30 minutes outside of Baker City. So
in the bus?
In the bus.
First, okay.
And then we built the house once we bought the
Same
property.
Place. Okay, yeah.
So we did that. But we didn't really land in Eastern Oregon until I was maybe 10, something like that. And then, I went to college in Portland and grad school in New York, stayed a while, and then came back to Seattle.
Yeah.
So
brothers and sisters in the bus too?
No, just me, but I do have two very much older sisters.
Oh, okay.
They're like 18 years older than me.
Okay. Were they part of the homestead experience for you, or just were they already gone? Okay. They were out and about. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's amazing. Yeah. And you mentioned some of the on-brand like culture. Or was there something you brought out of that experience that's a part of you today?
I think my parents are very much people that don't particularly care about the status quo, and they ask a lot of questions and they think very critically about the world. And it's not that we have a lot of money or that we have a lot of, power in the way that a lot of people think about it. But I think my parents are folks who have designed their own life, and because they've designed their own life, they have a lot of freedom to spend their time the way they want to spend their time and to prioritize the things that matter to them. So I think I've been able to, rather than always focusing on a very standard or traditional trajectory, be able to think about what I really want to be doing, how I want to spend my time, what are the ethics and the core values that I want to embed into how I'm spending my time. And so I've always felt very comfortable doing things my own way. And I think that comes directly from my parents.
It sounds like they, had a perspective that wasn't at least as affected by some of the status quo and the conditioning that goes into our societies. And because of that, they were experiencing some of that freedom that you picked up in thinking and reflection. Yeah. I want to come back to that. That's really amazing. And I want to reflect on your journey as an artist too. And was that beginning at this time in your life too? Did you have an awareness of resonating with the arts or gravitating towards
Yeah,
them?
so I mean, I was homeschooled. I mean, I started going to some classes in the high school time, but I was essentially homeschooled all the way through, which again gave me a lot of freedom of how I spent my time. And growing up, 30 minutes outside of this town of 10,000, but across the street there was a rural elementary school that had about 25 students. And of course, being a rural elementary school in Eastern Oregon, they had zero funding for any kind of creative programming, and they knew that I, across the street, played the piano. So they asked me if I wanted to start playing the piano and singing with the kids. And of course, me being an overachiever, I designed like a K through 6 music curriculum that I taught 5 days a week for 6 years. I started in the 8th grade and I did it all, or 7th grade, and I did it all the way through middle school and high school, 5 days a week. We would then start staging musical productions multiple times a year. By the time I graduated high school, we had the Oregon Symphony sending a quartet out to the middle of literal nowhere into the mountains to like perform the Cinderella waltz for our production of Cinderella. So
They
it came
to you all. How many people were coming?
it was a quartet from the symphony, and the symphony was doing a little community engagement work in general in Baker, but I was able to like talk them into sending this quartet specifically to be in our production, which was super special for the kids, But yeah, and I mean, I think that embedded for me that communities can make really incredible art because, a kid and a bunch of other kids shouldn't really be able to create this amazing program, but we did. And we started having parents from like an hour and a half away take their kids out of the schools in towns to try to send them to our tiny school because we had this really awesome arts programming happening. So it just really made me believe like these kids who there's only 20 of them in a building, but they were so exceptional. And what they were able to do was so exceptional because somebody believed in them. And I'm like, oh, that's all it takes is people to believe in everyday humans. And then they'll just rise to the occasion. So that's kind of embedded across like any sort of creative work that I've ever done. It's like, you don't have to be in a really big city. You don't need a flashy stage. You don't need anything except really just pure belief.
And that was 20 kids in the whole age range or just in the class?
Of K through 6,
K through 6, wow.
We got up to like 25.
Okay, up to 25 some years, but wow,
Yeah.
okay. That is an amazing story, and it's so, I mean, it's such an interesting foundation for the trajectory toward the OFT, Olympia Family Theater, by the way. So that's amazing. Who at this time, were there any mentors, artistic or otherwise, in these like formative years that were with you?
I mean, if you've been in a small town, there's not always a lot of arts programming. And we were really, really lucky. I think that our high school had a drama teacher, Lynn Burrows, who was super amazing. She dedicated so much time outside of her time as a public school teacher in a small town to making sure that there was a vibrant theater culture for all of the teenagers that wanted to be part of it. She would take us to nationals in Nebraska. She drove, her and her husband drove 18 high schoolers cross country camping with us at KOA campgrounds that we could spend a week in Nebraska at this like national theater convention. I don't know why she did it. She did retire several years later. Maybe that was the starting point. It's not something I would personally do to sign up to camp with that many kids, but that was the kind of thing that she would do with us. She would make sure that we went to Portland to go to the acting conferences. She'd make sure that we went to all of these statewide things, even though we were in this really small community, and even though she absolutely got no additional compensation. Like she just went above and beyond to enable us to like know what was out there as an option. So, and honestly, quite a few of the youth from Baker ended up going into college to study theater. And I think it's because we were able to even know that was possible because she made that reality for us.
Wow. Do you think about her, remember her? And
I mean, we're Facebook friends, etc.
She's in touch with your work today.
Yeah, I don't think she's super duper in touch with it, but I mean, I have certainly kept tabs on her, and my parents certainly keep me updated, and it's,
It's like a living mentorship. It's a relationship that's ongoing. It's really powerful. I think about the ways that arts move through concepts, but they really move through people and communities. And I just love that you acknowledged that lineage for us and helped us to remember a person along the way. So thank you for that. Yeah. You are now the artistic director at Olympia Family Theater, and you began when again?
October of 2021.
Yeah, yeah, very in the depth of the pandemic. Yeah. Can you tell us, and for those who might not have been to the Olympia Family Theater, what it's about, and then we'll get into what you do there.
Yeah, so OFT was started about 16 years ago by two awesome women, Jen Ryle and Samantha Chandler. They saw a need for a theater that was dedicated exclusively to all ages family programming in Olympia. So they bootstrapped together. They both put in $500 and they did a production of Alice in Wonderland in somebody's backyard. And there was really awesome community response and everyone was like, do more. So they did, and they built the company, and I think 6-7 years ago, maybe, we moved into what used to be the Capitol Playhouse space, which is where we are now on 4th Avenue East, which is a 102-seat black box theater. We have a costume shop, a scene shop. Pre-pandemic, we were running 5 main stage productions, a roster of after-school classes and camps, a little bit of touring programming, and essentially serving all ages in the community, but always centering youth at the heart of what we're really doing purpose and mission-wise.
And has the theater expanded a bit too, like the space?
Yeah, that's more recent. So since I've started, we've sort of been reopening the theater, recentering on like what's the heart of our purpose. Right now, we're really focusing on serving K through 12 as our primary age group, but also really wanting to make sure we're not framing ourselves so much as a children's theater, as a space that creates intergenerational programming for people of all ages. So the goal being that you could have a family come in, and the work that we're producing can capture the imagination of a child, but also appeal to the intellect of an adult. And so finding that really beautiful middle ground. The space next door used to be Naked Prosthetics. They make like fake fingers.
Okay.
And they moved out, before I even started, probably a year before. So that's been sitting empty. So we just signed a lease to take over that space, and we've knocked down all the walls in the front. So there'll be a studio space, essentially. We're putting in the new flooring as I speak, fixing the walls. So it expands our office spaces upstairs. Downstairs, there's a community media lab that'll be run by Wild Tiny Productions that has like audio, podcasting, video, whatever capabilities. The downstairs space can be used for workshops, small intimate performances, again, really centering young people and youth as the people that can really utilize this space. There's not a lot of all ages sober venues for young people to be going to in downtown Olympia. There are certainly awesome venues like the Voyeur, et cetera, but a lot of these venues have like a bar in the front or whatever. And so we just want to be a sober, all ages establishment for families and young people to be able to use for a whole roster of community-based events. So we're starting to get the inquiries about how to rent out that space, and we're starting to put together the sheets and the process for how people can access that space.
When is that projected to be online?
The floor will be done like in a week or two. So workshops and workshops and that kind of thing could probably happen there within a couple weeks.
Okay.
We just got a grant for putting in some like lighting equipment, some audio equipment, and that'll then, once we have that in a couple of months installed, we'll be able to do slightly more complex or like showy things. So you could put in like a music show or
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. I look forward to checking that out. And that's a great vision, just fitting right into the mission of the OFT. And tell us about your work at OFT.
We are currently doing a main stage season, so fully produced productions, and we do a roster of after-school classes and camps. A lot of the work that we're trying to do at OFT in terms of always paying a lot of respect to where OFT has come from, but also evolving it into the future. It's 2023. It's in the wake of the civil rights uprising of 2020. We have to be really aware of the stories that we're telling, and also who's telling the stories, and also how we're engaging people to tell those stories. So I believe very deeply that the how you do something is absolutely just as important as what you've actually done. So, and looking at our history as a predominantly white-led institution, there's, I think, a lot of implicit bias that has gone into some of the programming decisions, and that's okay. That happens at every organization, but it's how we move and evolve the work moving forward. So in this organization, in this season, we're trying to embed a lot more people of the global majority into leadership decision-making, into leadership positions and decision-making, which includes writing the plays, directing the plays, being on stage, board positions, staff positions, just kind of across across the whole thing. So racial equity is a huge focus of what we need to work on, in addition to social equity and these other things. But making sure that we're centering racial equity as our primary goal, and we're trying to do that in a joyful way too. We want to avoid the concept of like trauma porn or always hyper focusing on the struggle. So, for example, the first production in this season was The Secret Garden, which is a classic story that everybody knows. It's not my personal favorite story. I think there's a lot of colonialism in it, and I think that it tends to portray child abuse in kind of a weird way when you look at it. But that was a story that the community really wanted to put on, so we did. But we engaged a playwright, Mabel Reynoso, and she redid it for a modern day context in the Pacific Northwest with an entirely Latinx and indigenous cast. It was a bilingual script. It had punk music. It had puppetry. It was just a really fun and imaginative story that recentered the people. Different folks were able to tell the story, but it also didn't make it about struggle and pain and their identity. It just happened to be a bilingual play. We also had a non-binary character. So there was a lot of really cool things happening without making that the hyper focus. So just normalizing lots of different people being the storyteller is a huge part of what I want to see happen at OFT more and more as we move forward. There's a lot more that I could probably go into, but
maybe we'll get to it. But so your work as artistic director, were you directly engaged in some of those concept decisions and some of those like expressive decisions for that? Is that essentially what your role is?
Yes.
Okay. So pieces that come toward the OFT that want to be presented there, you work with them on how and what the content is. Is that?
Yeah. So, I mean, usually in planning a season, I play a pretty heavy role in that, or working with artists who might want to develop something and trying to figure out, does that fit within our mission? Does it fit within what we're trying to build at OFT? Do these folks have the relationships and the training and the know-how to be able to tell the stories that they want to tell? Is the story that they want to tell something that they should be telling, or someone else better positioned within, to tell that? So just sort of talking to people and figuring out what interests them, and then looking at that through an equity lens and deciding what is going to really support the goals that we have. Yeah,
you and I spoke earlier, and we talked about values, which is, I think, a really powerful way of communicating, what energizes a life without having some of the the baggage or charge of, perhaps like religious identification with, dogmas or anything like that. Values. We all work and operate in our lives with values. Sometimes we don't even know what they are. But I was curious to know from you what some of the values are that guide your work. I mean, you have an incredibly influential position as you're talking about content coming into a place of public presentation. So when you think about that, have you reflected on some of the values in your own life that influence you in your decision? Then I want to follow up with that with talking about how values happen in an organizational space. So what are some of the values that guide you, that guide your eye and your heart as this content comes toward you and really through you out in the community?
I think I personally try to embody a deep sense of integrity. I try to make decisions because they're decisions that I see that are needed socially across the board, right? As an example of how that plays out, maybe the example's next, but in 2020, for example, an incredible cohort of folks, the global majority, came together, theater makers specifically, and backstage, just theater people, and put together a list of essentially demands. And it was called We See You, White American Theater. And it was a list of demands of what they wanted to see predominantly white theaters doing in order to achieve racial equity, right? And that work was done. And there's a website, and there's all of this extensive knowledge. And so from a sense of integrity as a white theater leader, to pretend that doesn't exist is, to me, fundamentally wrong. Work was done, labor was done, and that was done for free. To me, yes, it's very direct and it's not sugar-coated, but it's also a labor of love to provide me a roadmap so that I know what to do and how to make the right move. So from a sense of integrity and accountability, it's only right to take the labor that people have given me and actually do something with it. So that's a big thing for me, is integrity and accountability, and keeping my eyes open to what's been done so that I can move forward and align myself with the movement that other people are making happen. Equity, of course, is also a big part of my core values. Racial equity is something that I center. I also think just a lot about economic equity, because I did grow up low income. So I have this very deep belief that access to art is a human right. I put that like on every website and everywhere that I am.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that.
And we do a lot of focus on making sure that anyone who wants to be in the building is able to, and that financial barriers do not get in the way of having a live arts experience, because live arts experiences change hearts, change minds. I think that not only does it make better people, it makes better communities when you have the culture embedded into the heart of your, society. So access to the art itself is also a really core value. Where if I'm going to make art, then for me, anything I make has to be accessible.
Thank you for describing, your values and how you understand them and work with them. And at the same time, you also work in community with boards, with your, the people who are coming to the plays, with the folks who are wanting to bring content to you. How do you balance what, is core to you that you just described with, some inherited culture that was with OFT, and then also with culture that you're getting from communities that want to have like the play that you don't love, and with folks who want to see plays that maybe you're challenging? How do you balance all of those together?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the equity piece, I don't balance it. We're just going to do it, and I'm going to embrace the challenges and the emotions that might bubble up because of that. I think that there's nothing to be gained by moving slowly when it comes to equity work. And it is 2023, and there's a plethora of resources to get into the hands of folks that have discomforts. So, I see a lot of organizations get really bogged down in doing so much training and talking about it that they don't quite get to the action part of the whole thing. So we are layering in, we're starting to do, we're making plans for this spring and summer to launch some more equity trainings for our staff and our board, and to, really make sure that we're all on the same page, and that we are, all speaking the same language and have the same toolkits. But at the same time, I can't let training get in the way of the actual progress, because equity is a life and death issue for some people. So other folk, we can't prioritize comfort over doing work that has to happen and that is way late. So in that way, I'm not a super balanced person. I'm just like, this is what has to happen. I will do it with a spirit of love. I'll sit down and talk to people, and I will embrace the challenges that bubble up. Absolutely down to talk about it. But I can't delay it.
Thank you for that. So when we think about, I want to ask a question that's a little bit abstract, but compared to what we were just talking about. But I wanted to ask about just the theater in general as a concept. And we're talking about these values and how they're presented to a community. When you think about theater compared to other, expressions of art, what is unique about theater that can be a place of wrestling and discernment and challenge with values and with emerging dynamics and culture? When you think about the theater, what is special about it?
Well, I think it's special is that we literally have to do it in person together, right? There's no anonymity. You're not like typing out your response on Facebook, being snarky on Instagram. There's no ability to disassociate from behind a screen. You have to sit shoulder to shoulder with people, breathe the same air, and be in the same space. And that automatically creates more empathy between people. It also creates more discomfort, because we're a lot more comfortable nowadays being behind a screen. And theater forces you to confront things in person and be in community with other people. And then also if you do theater oppressed activities, all these exercises, it literally makes you try on characters. It literally makes you try on walking in somebody else's shoes and to see a perspective by stepping into that perspective. So it's just like such a powerful tool for empathy and community building. And in a world that is increasingly divisive, and in a world that needs some really big changes, and those are really, really hard to make happen, doing it together as like humans in the same space, I think is a really powerful way to go further and farther together faster. I definitely, the pandemic has especially, siloed us behind
the screens. And, we were doing this podcast, we were doing it virtually for a long time, and the dynamic was really welcomed when we were able to be together, and the conversations just have a different kind of connection when they're like that.
Totally.
So yeah. I wanted to also give some time to that word access you were talking about. That is an important word to you. You mentioned it in our conversation. It's in your bio. And I wanted to ask where you have seen examples in your work where access has been denied. What did that look like, and how are you remembering that as you work in the OFT?
Yeah. I mean, cost is a huge issue when it comes to a lot of live arts experiences. I'm going to New York like in a week and a half, and even there, just like looking at ticket costs, I'm like, man, I can't afford 40 like this many tickets that are $45. Whoa, or like 100 and something, right? So for me, as someone who at this point is, I would say, making a middle class salary, but I'm like, what if you have a family? How are you going to bring like yourself and your partner and your 3 kids to like? So cost is a huge barrier. It's also a huge barrier for audiences. Theater in general has historically been a predominantly white art form as well. And so if you want to get more communities to come and even to try it out, to come and try something out for the first time in a space that you might even be a little uncomfortable walking into, and then you also have to pay a lot of money to walk into that space you might be a little uncomfortable entering, that's a huge barrier. So getting rid of cost as an entry point to walk in can really radically shift who even walks through the doors. Yeah. Prior to coming to Olympia, I worked for several years with Intiman Theater up in Seattle, which is a relatively socially progressive company. And we did a lot of experiments, and cost just continually comes up as a barrier. There's also so many barriers around disability access, and that's something at OFT that we're continuing to wrestle with. We had some funding last spring, so we were able to do our first ASL interpreted performances, and that felt really awesome. But simultaneously, we hadn't built up enough relationships in the community to have enough. Because if we have an ASL interpreter on stage and we have that happening, then we also want to have dozens of people who need interpretation services to be able to enjoy those interpretation services. So we're taking this year to sort of reevaluate, figure out how we can build relationships so that when we do offer ASL interpretation, which I hope we can start for next season, we've done the community outreach and the engagement that's necessary to like authentically engage with deaf and hard of hearing.
Production? Is that what you're talking about?
Not for every show and every production, but at least for 1 or 2 nights of every production that we'd be able to offer interpretation, because that's a huge barrier in access. There's additionally, and the one really great thing in the pandemic, honestly, was that all of this virtual content was pretty accessible. People adapted pretty quickly and realized that if they added captions to their virtual like media content, that was something that people can watch from home, that they have the captions. It was actually radically more accessible than a live arts experience often is. And it's made me wish, it costs money, and I know that it takes capacity and time, and arts organizations are often already overburdened, but I'm hoping that as we're moving through this pandemic, and hopefully someday starting to even maybe start to get out of it, that we can think of more hybrid programming, because the virtual media allows for a level of accessibility that can almost never be totally achieved in person. And it can, but if you have a really large budget, but these hybrid models are really cool in what they've been able to achieve for accessibility. So
it's happening, all in theaters and clubs, shows that used to just happen at a small bar somewhere, like they will now have some cameras and didn't take a lot for them to do it, but then they're now streaming the shows, and it just completely changes who can go, who's there, at the show, how they're participating with that venue and that artist. So it is when the pandemic, we're in a different time now. And the hybrid is just a part of who we are now.
Yeah, and it's awesome, and I'm hoping that we just continue to like streamline that.
Yeah. We also talked about your artistic journey, and the word healing came up a couple of times. And I'm just curious if you would share about that and how you understand or have experienced even healing in your artistic journey, and then we'll pivot to how that plays out in terms of more general ways too.
Yeah, well, a lot of my background is in theater of the oppressed, which is a form of theater started by a gentleman, Augusto Boal, in Brazil, and often called a rehearsal for the revolution. But it was a way of using theater as a political tool to organize people so that they would be able to have ideas and solutions for how to deal with oppressive governments in Brazil, essentially. And then he was exiled and went to Europe. And in Europe, there wasn't as much like guerrilla warfare on the streets or like outward oppression. In Europe, people were dealing with a lot of inward oppressions. And so he sort of reimagined Theater of the Oppressed. He called it Rainbow of Desire, but reimagined the work through the lens of helping people to work through their internal traumas and oppressions. And the thing that really sticks out when I'm thinking about Theater of the Oppressed, a phrase that you often hear, is that theater itself is not therapy, but it is therapeutic, right? Because working through things, trying on emotions, you're learning about emotional regulation and psychology and all of these things. There is something that can be very deeply healing in telling stories, in looking at your own story, in parsing your story apart and having other people like also listen to your story or reflect your story back to you or show your story to you in a way that maybe makes you reflect on it in a different way. Like there's so many levels within that can be really deeply therapeutic and healing, as you're saying. The arts just in general have an incredible ability to capture everything that we're going through and allow us to change the narrative sometimes in a way that's profound and really meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I remember back, when I was like learning guitar and there was a lot of stuff going on in my family and stuff. I didn't know the healing was happening at the time, right? And I look back on it, it's like, oh yeah, that was like without having that, in that place and time, like I don't know. And so I look back on that and I put that word healing to it, even though at the time it was just this experience of and I wouldn't even have called it the arts at that time either, but I look back on it now with a lot of deep gratitude, so that's an example from my own path with the arts of where healing was a part of my journey. Is there a specific moment that you remember that you could name now with healing in arts for you?
I mean, I guess I feel like art has just always been a thing that if I'm not doing well, I just sort of turn to something, right? Going to the theater feels like going to my home. Being in a circle of people, doing silly things, exercises, games, whatever, the laughter. Like if I'm feeling here at the end, when I go into a more theatrical space or a circle, I'm going to feel here at the end. And so I think it's less like one specific moment and more just knowing that for me, putting myself in that communal space in a theater is going to make me feel better. And that has happened and played out time and time and time again. So it's for me a place where I can go to like, remember who I am, recalibrate myself, come back to center. Yeah,
thank you. Yeah. And I wanted to also then talk about the work that you've done with incarcerated communities too. We both actually share a background in working up at the Monroe Correctional Complex in slightly different capacities and in different blocks of years. But the thing that's shared is coming into contact with the stories of the people who live there and inmates, and that for me was a revelation in my life of hearing these stories and some of the consistencies in their stories and stories I'd never heard in my life before. And I was working in a different capacity. Tell us about the work that you were doing at the Monroe Correctional Complex.
Sure. So when I moved to Seattle, I had been doing work in prisons in New York, and I knew I wanted to continue that work. I think a lot about it in terms of, I know a lot of people who will dabble in prison work. And so it's always been really important to me. I'm not there as a voyeur. I'm there for a sense of shared struggle and a shared belief that we can use the arts in a way that can rehabilitate and make a better society and make better people. And if we all believe that, then we can do this work collectively together. But ultimately, they're serving time. And so the only real valuable thing that I can also give is time. So in coming to Seattle, I wanted to make sure that I was still even if I can't maintain the relationships with the people that I had in New York, I wanted to continue to give time to this like struggle that we were all trying to work to figure out and solve. So UBB was a way, University Beyond Bars was a way for me to continue to get involved. It's very difficult to just become a volunteer and get into the Department of Corrections. There's so many obstacles that are put into the way of volunteering. And University Beyond Bars is a really awesome and respected and trusted by the DOC, which is most important organization that helps incarcerated folks get associates and bachelor's degrees. And they're essentially doing college level coursework, which is fantastic. And so I was able to start working with UBB offering theater courses, and I did everything from like theater of the oppressed / applied theater to teaching just like straight up acting and theater history to I guess 1 6-month course where over the course of 6 months we devised an original play that was centering on like the cause of American violence. Right. And, you know, some really beautiful things came out of that where we were talking about how physical violence is like the last manifestation of violence. Physical violence always comes out of psychological, spiritual, or emotional violence, like that these like more subtle forms of violence have, you know? And so it was just like this really beautiful process. And, you know, to the point of it being rehabilitative or healing, if you will, the relationships that the participants were able to make with each other, the trust that they were able to have, you know, it always means a lot to me in a prison setting just to be able to have people laugh and have fun and be silly, because prison is not a silly place. And the mask that you have to wear is a very specific type of mask. So to be able to create a space where you can be silly and take the mask off, to me is like the number one indicator of something being successful and allowing someone to heal just a little bit. While maybe also making a play about American violence, which, by the way, they selected. I did not put that on them. That was a group decision. I never go in and tell a group what they ever need to talk about. I have a variety of skill sets and tools that I know how to use. It's up to them to tell the story, and then I just put my tools on the table and we use my tools together. That's it. So I'm trying to be really like, I'm not here to tell anyone about their story or their experience.
The work I was doing, it was not like arts related, but we were doing more like legislative priorities and empowerment issues with some of the guys who had identified as lifers 20 years or more, even though it was an open group. And we did conferences where guys would tell their stories, because we just really believe that the story is like the centerpiece of how people are going to be moved to make legislative decisions. So what I found is that there were some people who began to share their stories who hadn't done that before, and they were in a trusted space, but they were practicing like vulnerability, you know, and that's something that's also a more rare commodity in incarcerated settings. And there was something transformative about having vulnerability happen in a safe space where your story can come out, you know. I'm curious, when you all had this cohort together and you were developing the play, were a lot of these men experienced in doing theater or writing or any of those things, or were there people that were new to it and like really at their edge, you know, for comfort or growth?
Yeah, I mean, over the course of 6 months, we started with, I think, 26
That's a lot,
people. Yes. And then by the time we did the play, I think we were down to about 15. It was also over the course of, 6 months, there's people coming and going different. But we ended with about 15. I had already taught classes at UBB, so I was already starting to get sort of a core group of about 6, 8 people that were like, hardcore, we do theater, which was awesome. Okay. So I had, some like returning like theater peeps that like were like in it to win it, but there were also people that were like, what are we doing? What's going on? And the theater room is also, it's, you have to like run around and play all these really silly games and mix up and do a bunch of, I intentionally make some of those classes almost more silly than I'll do for elementary students because I want to shock them a little bit out of the like, I'm just going to sit here in the corner and be cool kind of energy. And I'm like, no, we're actually all going to be butterflies now, Something that's just like, what is this crazy lady trying to make us do? But in that, like in doing something as, I don't know if I ever actually made them do that. It's just what comes to mind. But in making people do really silly,
have before.
I could have,
Okay.
yeah, I could have very easily done that at some point. But in making them do those kinds of things, there's something about laughing. Again, it's that laughing and sharing space together in person that like breaks down some barriers. And as you probably know, within like a prison setting, there's a lot of segregation between different groups, like racially, et cetera, and people sort of stick to their own. And I have never allowed that in the theater classroom. And even in a lot of UBB classes, we talk about as teachers, like, don't always worry about busting up the cliques, kind of let people sit where they want to sit. You don't have to get in the middle of all of that. And I never allowed that in a theater room. So like coming out of that process, we had some really beautiful reflections. Specifically one person who's like, I've been here for 15 years and I have never had a friend outside of my own race until now. And now I have all of these friends, and this is the first time I've ever had anyone outside of my own group to be friends with in this facility.
Does that mean that you had to name what you're seeing and then disrupt it? Like the cliques or the groups?
No,
How did you do that?
I feel like even if they're in cliques or groups, I've always felt so much graciousness and love from the participants, where they know that potentially, also I think partially because I'm a woman, that it might be more uncomfortable for me to come in there, and then I'm also driving an hour and a half. So there's like always at least some amount of grudging respect where they're like, I guess we'll do whatever wacky thing this person is asking us to do. So I never name it. I just make them do really, really wacky things. And it just somehow, playing the games and doing that stuff just erases it. Yeah. And it's happened in every class I've had. So there's something about play that gets rid of a lot of that other stuff.
Yeah. But there's play and there's laughter. And I can just hear how rich and deep that laughter would be. But then when they came to their content, they focused in on violence.
Yeah, it ended up being a play about reentry and about three different men who were going to be re-entering society. And it was a story about how they were all navigating reentry based on like the violence they had experienced inside.
Wow. But you talked about how they mentioned other layers too. How did they reference or name those other types, like the spiritual, emotional? Was that more like discussions in the background? It was
kind of discussions in the background, but then it informed the characters and informed the psychological journey of someone re-entering after they've experienced this. Like, how are they going to deal with the real world? When do they break down? What are their insecurities, right? Like all of those internal things. So it wasn't necessarily didactic, like we have to name it, but it's informing how those characters are navigating the world that they're in.
Do you happen to know if any of those guys were getting close to their release date, or any
a couple of them were, and
they?
that I think that was part of it too, is that it was also sort of in a way like rehearsal and reflection for a couple of the people that were going to be released.
Yeah. I mean,
and I'm also saying people because we actually did have some trans folks as well. One woman specifically, Kim, who was a part of pretty much every theater workshop I ever did at UBB. And that's another thing with Department of Corrections is that they'll just put trans women into male prisons.
Okay. Thanks for naming that. Yeah. In my time there, we didn't have that, and we didn't have any trans persons in our spaces. So I appreciate you naming that. And I'm really glad that they were in the space with you. Yeah. And as a person gets closer to their release date, they are doing a lot of reflection. And your classes were asking people to flex and to practice who they are, who they could be, and when you get ready to exit, I mean, that work is just going on in spades with people. Who am I going to be? Who am I going to become? And the skills that you were offering them, joy, flexibility, adaptability. I mean, those are amazing assets to have as you're getting ready to enter into a society you might not have been in for 2, 3, I don't know, decades, or even 10 years being in that space and coming out. It's just,
cell phones alone, are totally different, or, hosts having conversations with them specifically because we had a mixed group gender-wise to be able to talk about pronouns. And they're like, what? People are actually having these conversations out and about? And I'm like, yes, this is like a thing that's very common in Seattle now. Like you definitely need to be able, to talk about pronouns. Whoa.
Yeah. Where did y'all do it then, the production?
We just did it right there in the UBB in the education building.
Okay. For other...
some other inmates, but also we were able to bring in an outside audience, which was also really exciting for them. So I think we brought in like maybe 2 or 3 dozen people. And
that's so
they were
good.
very excited. It was a very small classroom,
Yeah.
but it was really awesome. And coming out of that, we had like a group that was like, we want to just start doing this. We want to start devising plays, writing plays. We want to do it. Because I think that happened in late 2018. And so we had been setting up structure so we could have a long-term theater program out Monroe, and then the pandemic started.
Yeah.
So,
but then that facility in Monroe, the Washington State Reformatory, is shut down now in 2021. So
totally. And I mean, also that was just that particular facility had such a wealth of programming.
Yeah,
and
really
so
did.
that was such a complex decision, because on the one hand, I definitely believe in closing prisons, but I also am like, maybe close the ones that have the least amount of programming first.
Yeah.
Rather than, because, Monroe had such a reputation in the state as being the most liberal prison, the most resourced prison, the place where you could have college level classes and yoga classes and theater. Like there was a lot going on. So I'm just like, could have closed like Walla Walla, but it's fine.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Kennedy Ridge, whatever. Yeah. So as we're getting ready to wrap up, thanks for coming today. And I just wanted to ask you if there's anything else you'd like to share about Olympia Family Theater to folks before we kind of wrap up today, about stuff that might be coming up, that you're excited about personally, or just if no one's been there before, how would you try to get them in the door?
Yeah. Well, let's see. We have access for all pricing. So, the barrier is very low to come try it out. If you're not sure, you don't need to spend a ton of money. You could just walk in. I'm sorry, but
that's new, right? That's like in the last year-ish or so?
Yeah, since we reopened in spring of 2021.
And that's a really big deal. I just wanted to celebrate that and for a minute, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah.
And also the same is true of all of our classes and camps. So when we have summer camps this summer, same thing for kiddos. There's not like a price barrier. We don't do scholarships anymore. We don't want people having to prove to us that their child deserves an arts experience. Every kid deserves to make art over the summer. So it's just sliding scale. Just do what makes the best sense for your family. That's really important to us. Yeah. We have a couple shows coming up this spring. We have a show called The Girl Who Swallowed a Cactus. It's a really fun.
Say it again. What was
The
it?
Girl Who Swallowed a Cactus.
Okay.
It's like an environmental allegory storytelling piece about a bunch of kids who have to save the world and convince a bunch of it's going to be a fun storytelling piece, very environmental themed. And then we're going to be doing an immersive Alice in Wonderland musical situation.
What does that mean? Like when you say that immersive?
That means that like the theater, the lobby, the next door space, you're going to like wander around in the space to have part of the story told. And then you'll land in the theater to actually see this Alice in Wonderland.
Okay. That's really cool.
And I think it's also just great to remember, like, I think sometimes people think of Olympia Family Theater and think that we're just a children's theater, but we really do try to select material that's intergenerational in nature. So I think the sweet spot for me is that Pixar effect, where I see as many adults walking into a Pixar movie as I see kids. And that's the energy we'd like to have at OFT. Like from top to bottom, anyone could really enjoy the content on our stage.
Yeah, I mean, the way of thinking about the word family is like beloved community too. And like when we're in touch with those ties that bind us, and I feel like you're seeking that, with these expressions at OFT. So thank you so much. But I always ask before we wrap up too, I ask about hope, and I ask about ways that you might define hope, or where you might see it in the world today. So as we conclude, how do you name hope, or where are you seeing it play out or be expressed today in the world?
I mean, on a really basic level, we live in an absolutely stunning part of the world. I love the Pacific Northwest. And a lot of times when I personally need hope, I just go outside. The natural world that we are surrounded by, there's oceans, there's volcanoes, there's mountains, there's incredible natural wonder. You can walk down here and see salmon swimming. You can see sea lions. So I find a lot of personal just peace and hope and everything I need by reminding myself that I live in this incredible place, and that the land that we live on is really special, and that now we are part of a like millennia old tradition of stewarding this land, and like how lucky are we to be here. The young people at Olympia Family Theater, we just launched our first ever teen leadership council. They're so smart, they're so awesome. these generations that are coming up are so much more aware of things, and I just continue to see with every generation more openness, more expansive thinking, more care and empathy, and more focus on community. And so I just somehow believe that things are going to continue to get better and more loving in the world that we live in, because I see kids just, the younger they are, the more open they are, and they just sort of continue to build a more open space. So that's like really exciting to see. And I just think that it will somehow all work out.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We should have some of those teen council members on an upcoming episode of this. That'd be really cool.
They'll be devising a play this spring. We just picked out some of the themes. One of the themes is what would happen if everyone had a safe place to live. So I think there'll probably be some themes around houselessness and things in that play. So that might be
the spring.
Yeah, or the first weekend in June they'll perform that.
Let's stay in touch about that. That would be a great synergistic episode to talk about that and some of the ways that we understand that. And then Interfaith Works is also planning a youth sleep out for homelessness, and I believe it's early May, where youth can participate in a night where they have very impromptu shelter and they learn about what it means to survive and be outside with other people. So I just wanted to plug that too. But thank you so much, Lily, for being here today.
Corey.
Yeah, and so this has been this episode of Lean in Olympia. Thank you all for being here with us today. And as I said, you can check out past episodes on our Spotify and our YouTube and our website too at interfaith-works.org. Again, thank you to our guest today, Lily Raabe, and just really appreciate you and your ongoing work. Okay, peace, everyone.
Bye.